Angela Denker is a Lutheran pastor and veteran journalist. She's written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Fortune magazine. Denker has appeared in CNN, BBC, and Sky News to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism in the U.S. Her book, Red State Christians, Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump, was the 2019 Silver Foreword Indies Award winner for Political and Social Sciences. The new version of Red State Christians, subtitled A Journey into Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind, is currently available for pre-order wherever books are sold. It will release August 16th. This was a very fun conversation with Angela. Learned a lot. Please check it out. Also check her book out. It's just worth listening to. And she did a great job doing the listening by traveling across the country and talking to lots of different people. So please get a little taste for that here in this time together. And I hope you enjoy. Today we have with us Angela Denker. Angela, thanks for having time to come chat with us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I got connected with Angela a little bit ago after reading her book, Red State Christians, Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump. As we dug a little deeper into this campaign and I wanted to do a month specifically on kind of Christian politics, it quickly morphed into a little more of a general concept of Christian nationalism, understanding what that means and why it exists. But your book really intrigued me on several levels. But before we get to that, I'm just more interested to hear a little bit about you and your background. You were a journalist, sports writer even, turned Lutheran pastor. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I currently live in Minneapolis. This is where I grew up. It's a unique place in the country because there are a lot of Lutherans up here. And when I worked as a pastor in Orange County, California, or even in Las Vegas, people would be like, Lutheran? Is that Christian? Like, what is that? So yeah, I grew up and the two strains of both my career in journalism, my work in sports, which was so much fun. I covered the Super Bowl, was a beat writer for a hockey team, covered, NFL, MLB, NBA occasionally, got to do all of that. And what I felt though, when I was spending so much time in sports, what I really loved most about it was getting to tell the stories of athletes and getting to really understand them and their background. And for many of them, a big part of their story was their spiritual journey, their faith. And I felt like when I was telling those stories for secular publications, I was sort of doing it with my hand tied behind my back because the focus still had to be on the sports. And I felt like, I got into journalism, believe it or not, because I wanted to tell the truth, and exposing the truth was really important to me. And I felt like there was a greater truth bound up in spirituality, bound up in the story of Jesus. And I was really interested in getting to tell that greater story of truth, which is why in 2009, I left full-time sports writing in Florida at the time and went to seminary, and then have spent the past almost 10 years as a pastor, while also returning to my roots in journalism, getting to report on these intersections between religion and culture and politics. I have a chapter on sports in my book, which was just such a fun experience to do. And this overarching sense that there is a greater truth that we need to talk about in the US, and often it's buried beneath a lot of layers. And there's a lot of reasons that people don't want to really talk about the truth. So that's been sort of my guiding light throughout all of this. And it continues to be interesting to watch where, God is putting me in surprising situations all the time.
Yeah. So it sounds like journalism really kind of set you up from a pastoral perspective to keep digging in on like the intersections and the curiosities of culture and politics. Because like you said, truth, one thing to like be pastoral and talk about truth from the pulpit level, but then also truth, like how do we keep digging deeper in other levels? So I think that's fascinating and really intriguing because I almost wish more pastoral figures were on that level. I'm kind of curious. So you grew up Lutheran, and my dad's actually in Wisconsin now, and my family's from southern part of Michigan. So yeah, a lot of Lutherans. How did that impact positively or negatively the goal that you were trying to do with Red State Christians when you started digging into politics? Because I'm a Southern white evangelical background kid. Lutheran was like, yeah, like you said in California, like foreign, like, is that Christian? If it is, like, oh, that's like one of those weird mainline. Did that impact how you were interacting with people? Because it's a very unique, I mean, it's one thing to go politically different into someone's world and talk to them, but then also religiously, how did that play a role in like entering scenarios, or whether that was a barrier?
I think I've been shaped by, so my grandfather was a Lutheran pastor. His grandfather came over from Germany as a Lutheran pastor. So it's certainly part of my roots, but also, my grandpa had a hard time in the church. He was very outspoken in the 1960s and was kind of ahead of his time. He also got divorced. So he had a complicated relationship with the Lutheran church. He didn't, when I got ordained, he didn't come. So I had, I approached it with this sense of this is part of my heritage, and also this is a human flawed institution. And then growing up, in the 90s, early 2000s, it was cool to be evangelical, right? In some sense, as, if you were part of the popular American Christian movement, you were dipping your toe into evangelicalism in some way. So while I was confirmed in the Lutheran church, I, went to youth group at, I think, a Covenant church. I went to a Baptist Bible camp growing up. And then I went to the University of Missouri for college. I have a journalism degree from there. And I was in a Bible study, and I was the only person in my Bible study who was baptized as an infant. So, that was, consistently, I was always in dialogue with people who were brought up in more of the dominant American Christian experience of either Southern Baptist or more generally non-denominational evangelical. And certainly as a sports writer, when I was speaking with people about religion, the most popular sort of religious experience in American sports culture is either from the Black church, which has been such an inspiring experience for me to hear about and experience, and also, white Southern, football coach evangelicalism. So I spent a lot of time that those experiences shaped me as well. I got really into what we used to call contemporary worship. The churches that I served at, particularly in Vegas and in Orange County, they were Lutheran in name, but really evangelical in style. So, the pastors didn't wear albs. We had a band up there. Most of our staff did not come out of a Lutheran tradition. So I feel fortunate to have lived sort of in both worlds. And of course, as an ordained woman, right, there are limits to how much I'll be accepted in evangelicalism. And that was something that I knew very early on, and have nonetheless sought to see the gifts of that tradition, and also have been very clear about where I will never fully be accepted in that tradition, in many of those traditions. So,
yeah. I guess, like, so I'm curious, like, so you had all these experiences, you've been interacting with a lot of different people for sounds like for a long time, not just in journalism, but in youth group even. What was that moment though? Was there a moment where, like, the book, was it the inauguration of Donald Trump that, like, kind of triggered that? Or what were the experiences leading to you thinking, I need to understand this more? Maybe that's just your journalism heart, like, constantly pumping and telling you what you want to, like, learn more about. But, like, was there a particular instance, or, like, that kind of drove you to think through the idea of going to these different places and engaging with people? Or?
Yeah, I think certainly have to give credit to the Holy Spirit, because this wasn't necessarily planned. So in 2016, I was working at, again, this large sort of Lutheran, quote unquote, mega church in Orange County, California, birthplace of Richard Nixon, Yorba Linda. And, just watching the ways that election sort of burst into our church, and watching the ways that families became divided, everything suddenly seemed fraught. I began to see very quickly that within our own church, we had very different ideas of who Jesus was and what Jesus meant. And so I lived through that as a pastor and walked through that with my congregation, with my family, and began also feeling that call, as you mentioned, from my journalism background to say, I think that I have some things to say theologically and as a writer that go beyond this congregation. And I really want this to be read by people who may not ever go to a church, let alone a Lutheran church. So I began writing for a broader audience. My church didn't love that. They, saw me as, you're our pastor. Some people liked it. I won't say everyone, but some of the folks in leadership, some of our more influential lay leaders, they just didn't feel comfortable with that. So I made the decision in May of 2017 to leave that congregation, to come back home to Minnesota for a number of reasons too. My husband got a job here. We were going to be close to my parents. And at that time, I pitched a book to what was then Fortress Press called Bibles and Boob Jobs, looking at particularly Christianity in Southern California and in Orange County, and how that influence really led to the election of Donald Trump. You saw churches in Orange County, Southern California, really being able to marry sort of all this wealth, all this opulence, all this, pop culture influence, reality TV with Christianity in a really unique way. And you can see how that laid the groundwork for a candidate like Trump coming out of reality TV, coming out of ostentatious wealth, coming out of not at all a traditional Christian background. You can see how those churches in Orange County, some of them like Crystal Cathedral, televised all over the country. Rick Warren, his books read all over the country. That sort of laid the groundwork for Christians who may not have generations earlier ever considered voting for someone like Trump. They embraced him, I think, in part because of this groundwork that was laid in Southern California. Yeah. So I pitched that book. It survived as a chapter title, but it was really my editor who said, we love this pitch. We want to do this book, but we don't want it to just be Orange County. We want a look at the entire country. And, fortunately, giving me some travel money to go ahead and do some of these trips. And I think where I really find myself, we had an explosion of books post 2016. What happened? How did Trump get elected? And there was this, and then for people who did vote for Trump, they kind of felt like, well, why am I this weird subject to be studied? Particularly conservative Christians thought, they felt they were being condescended to. So where I found myself in sort of a unique place is I approached my book from three lenses: that of a pastor who was really looking to understand folks and also to see through a theological lens, which I think is missing from a lot of the studies, which have been super helpful, super important. You've got sociological studies of Christian nationalism, like the book by Andrew Whitehead, Samuel Perry, Taking Back America for God. You have historical studies of Christian nationalism and how masculinity played into that from my friend Kristen Kovas-Dumais, Jesus and John Wayne, hugely influential. And I really wanted to add in that theological perspective of how American Christians see God is directly tied to our embrace of Christian nationalism and our embrace of a politics that has strayed really far away from sort of this traditional Christian ethic of love God, love your neighbor, forgive, turn the other cheek. we've strayed really far from that. And theology, how we understand God, is a big, big part of that, as is history, as is sociology.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you were out of Southern California when you pitched the chapter or for the book, Bible and Boot. I don't know how the church would have liked that very much, but
it's kind of tongue in cheek. I mean, I love that church.
No, I did
too. A lot of friends there. It's cool.
Was that kind of like your first experience as a pastor, but even kind of really acknowledging seeing that active division in a church? Because I'm sure you were attending churches before you were a pastor. So like, was that election kind of like a real, I don't know, wake up call of like, oh my gosh, within these four walls, people are really divided? Was that, would you say that was kind of the first time you experienced that? Or
I think what was unique about what churches experienced after Trump's election is that I think particularly in large churches, so churches that had really bought into the church growth movement popularized by Willow Creek pastor Bill Hybels, and sort of this movement in the 80s and the 90s that saw the church as an instrument of capitalism and saw the church as sort of a corporate model. So you begin to see pastors begun to see themselves as a CEO. And so we built churches that in many cases were a mile wide and an inch deep. You've probably heard that said, and that was said before Trump. But so we had a lot of people that were sort of loosely affiliated, often around a charismatic lead pastor. Theology was sort of light, it was often premised on an individualized Christianity. What does God think about me? How am I personally forgiven? What should I personally do in my life as sort of stereotypically white middle class or upper middle class businessman? And so churches tried really hard not to be controversial, not to take controversial stands. You see that even when you look at a lot of church websites and you try to figure out, are they LGBTQ or not?
Yeah.
It's, and so I think what the election of Trump did is it forced a lot of these issues that churches had been trying to cover up into the center stage, whether it was racism, whether it was how we treat women, how we view gender roles, how we view issues about refugees and immigration. Trump, as has been said too many times, said the quiet part out loud. And I think that it forced churches to sort of, there was a sense in which people felt like they had to pick a side. And I think, Jesus famously said, I did not come to bring unity, but I came to bring division. And in some cases, the churches needed, I always early on sort of said that was the part of Trump that was important for the church, was that it forced these things that had been hidden for so long into the open. But it has caused, I think it's been, like I said, a watershed moment for a lot of churches, and churches divide all the time. Lutheran church loves to divide, over the smallest, stupidest things.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think, again, this was a watershed moment for a lot of churches that had been focused much more on economics, on their budgets, on their buildings than they had on theological issues.
I mean, I agree. I can't really remember a time in my youth, though I'm sure there was divisions, and there always has been, but like at the end of the day, that election did seem to like really heighten this idea of choosing a side. And I even wonder how much that impacted COVID being as big of a deal as it was for the church. Again, like people within the church, I mean, dude, mask mandates and vaccine, like church is just, it was almost like it went more wild than after that election. And I almost wonder if it laid the groundwork for that. But to your point, I feel like maybe there are some positives in the sense of bringing stuff to light, despite the division, and we won't know probably for a while. Time will tell. But I guess I want to hear a little bit about the true experiences you've had, kind of walking to some of these places and where you went. But first, I'm just curious to paint a picture for anyone listening, like theologically speaking. You kind of laid the groundwork a little bit already about kind of the corporate consumerism style of church. But what were some of the other theological elements that you were seeing trends in that maybe were more rooted in things like apocalyptic theology or how we view the earth and end times and the secular sacred divide? Was that what are some of those things that you felt like were kind of consistent themes throughout your visits?
Well, one thing that Trump did again that I think was missed by a lot of the national media when looking at quote unquote the Christian vote, what Trump did was bring together sort of this global Pentecostalism that again talks a lot about the end times, talks a lot about, an apocalyptic vision of what's happening in America. He married that with a more traditional Southern Baptist, evangelicalism. And he sort of brought those two things together. So you have somebody like Paula White, big, Trump supporter, his personal pastor, somebody who I've interviewed and attended her church, standing on a stage with somebody like Franklin Graham. And, bringing those two things together brought a lot of voters into Trump's camp. But what it also did, I think, is something that I think, prosperity gospel preachers, as they talk about this sense that, if you give your money to God, if you devote your life to the church, you will receive material rewards. That sort of message can be understood actually looking all the way back to a more ancient theology and looking back to even the Reformation, things that Martin Luther talked about, that can be understood contextually as a theology of glory, which is this sense that following Jesus follows a linear pattern of worldly success, worldly power. And the theology of glory sort of became the dominant viewpoint of a lot of Western Christianity all the way back in like AD 300, when the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity on his deathbed. And Christianity goes from being this marginalized, persecuted religion in the Roman Empire to being all of a sudden they're the state religion. And so there's all this power, there's all this wealth that goes along with Christianity beginning at that point. And we begin to see all the way through the Middle Ages, all this wealth and power concentrated in Christianity. So you have, gold inlaid cathedrals, basilicas. The church becomes one of the largest landowners in Europe. And one of the major critiques of the Reformation, which, my ancestors came out of generations and generations ago, was that idea that Christianity is tied up with worldly success, worldly power, totally goes against the story and the truth of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That Jesus was a victim of capital punishment from the state. That Jesus was a victim of the uniting of the Jewish religious elite at the time, and the Roman government, that they teamed up together because they were threatened by what Jesus was saying about power and about money and about wealth. So what Martin Luther called theology of the cross, I think, has also existed in American religion. But what theology of the cross lifts up is this truth that a lot of times when you follow Jesus, when you seek to live your life according to a biblical ethic, which is to forgive others, which is to give away yourself, which is to give away your money, which is to serve others first, to turn the other cheek, to pray for your enemies, all these things, when you live in that way, most of the time you're not going to get a lot of worldly success. You're not going to get a lot of worldly power. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was killed in the concentration camp. The Apostle Paul was killed. He spent most of his life in jail. Jesus was crucified, right?
Yeah, the ultimate one, yeah.
So as American Christianity has begun to see itself as allied with American government, this sense, well, America is a Christian nation. All of those things fit into a framework of theology of glory. Yeah. And so for me, as a theologian, as a pastor, Christian nationalism should be understood as part of a theology of glory. And we have to counter that with a theology of the cross, which says that God's power is often housed in weakness. And it says that God's truth is often told by people who are ignored, people who are dismissed, people who are marginalized. And theology of the cross is this paradoxical truth which requires us to constantly question the things that we think we know axiomatically. So particularly, I think for us as white Christians, we have to constantly question this sense that us and our ancestors have been on the right side of history in the US. We have to constantly question this idea that we live in a country that has held true to Christian ethics, when we also live in a country that has enslaved African Americans, that has killed Indigenous Americans. So that's kind of the overarching theological framework that I just have become more and more convinced of in all my travels and all my research and in my work today, as a small town rural Midwestern pastor who lives in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that does a really unique and good job of the overarching reality. Theology of glory, i.e. power, which is funny because there's people in that camp that probably aren't powerful or rich, but they totally adhere to that concept because it's so rooted culturally in this idea of something like, clearly America's blessed, to the point of even things like we helped instigate and place Israel in 47 and whatever it is, these things that they point to. So I think I like that because it really, it's one thing if you talk about prosperity gospel, money, and people who like promote this, like you reap what you sow literally tangibly through money. Because I know plenty of people who aren't like that at all, but they still have this idea that like, we are blessed, glory, power. They just wouldn't probably define it that way because they don't necessarily see power in the same way. So I think that's super unique because what we were finding too was like how things like the real heightened purity culture of things like true love waits in the 90s, 80s and 90s is like this idea of the crumbling of the nation, the moral evolution, which would decay us to the point of no longer receiving God's blessing or whatever it is. It all seems to kind of be rooted in this idea of power, theology of glory. So I like that. I'm curious then, walk us through like the experiences. I mean, like, so you went to several places, I think 5 or 6 places, very varying degrees of theology and types of churches. And I'll just encourage people, go ahead and just read the book. We can't really get into all of it. But how did people receive you? Did people feel threatened? Were they enthusiastic? Were they excited to tell you? Maybe try to convert you? And I mean, what was kind of that reception like?
Yeah, well, getting to do the travel for this book was such an incredible gift. I mean, I still, especially post-COVID now, looking back at that year of 2018 and all the places I went, all the people I got to meet and spend time with, I'm just incredibly grateful for it. It was a dream come true especially for a reporter. I love that. Yeah. And one of my main problems with the ways that the election was being reported on is I just thought so many stories weren't getting told. So that was one of my major goals going into the book, is I wanted to tell the stories of the people whose voices just were not being heard. And so I think I really succeeded with that. I'm really proud of some of the work that was done with that, whether it was the time I spent with Arab American Christians in Houston, time I spent with Hispanic Christians at the US-Mexico border in El Paso, the time I spent, in Appalachia. By the grace of God, I was received, pretty well in most places. I'll say, when I went to Prestonwood Baptist Church, it's Jack Graham's church in Plano, Texas. I went there on 4th of July weekend, and on the
that in and of itself,
just
going somewhere like that on Independence Day weekend.
And on the advice, so I started out my reporting trips in January of 2018 at the March for Life, which was the first time that a sitting president had ever addressed the March for Life with Trump. And while I was there, I spent a lot of time with a few folks from the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, which at that time was headed by Russell Moore. And I really have to give credit to some of those pastors for sort of opening my eyes in a way that I didn't fully grasp at the time, how deeply entrenched a lot of American churches were into Christian nationalism. And so it was one of those pastors who really said, you got to go to Prestonwood on 4th of July weekend. So when I went there, I did not tell people I was a pastor. I just sort of say I worked at a church because I know, again, for a lot of people that you say you're a female pastor, and for a lot of people, and this is another thing I want to break down with the book, is that we've developed a sort of social media shorthand for when we interact with other people in our lives. And so we find out it's almost like we're, a Facebook advertiser trying to put each other into categories. And so for a lot of Christians, when they heard, okay, you're a woman and you're a pastor, immediately it's like, oh, you're a far left liberal, you're crazy, you're, practicing a Christianity that we don't adhere to. And I didn't, feel the need to go down that road with people because they don't know my story. They don't know my background. This book isn't about me. And, the other thing that I noticed too is I am a white 30-something middle-class woman where I could walk into spaces and I pretty much was accepted, wherever I went. Right. If I was someone who presented differently, if I was not cis, if I was not, married to a man, right, it may have been a different experience for me.
You didn't have to give any preface. It's like, no. If you did say you were a pastor, then now you're up against an automatic presumptuous wall. But yet, even without that, you were able to go in, unlike you said, several people, different demographics who couldn't even probably have that conversation or try to have that conversation just because
right.
of the immediate, visible, obvious.
Right. So I was grateful for that. And I think, being a young woman, often people sort of underestimate, oh, how cute, you're doing a little reporting project. So, I'll use that to my benefit.
Ride the wave.
So, I think where I really most powerfully saw this truth of theology of the cross, I saw it everywhere. I went to Mariners Church in Orange County, which is on Newport Coast, got to be one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. But I went to sort of youth worship night and I listened to this pastor who, unfortunately, he's no longer there. But his name was Wes. He's half Tongan, half Hispanic, native Orange County guy. And he's up there preaching in Mariners, which is a church that has, again, sort of fully embraced this church growth model, this sense, wealth is power, is blessing, all is good, and he's preaching a really countercultural message to that, to a bunch of young kids. And so when I spoke with him after, he talked about what it was like to be in that environment. And, the first time he preached to the big group on Sunday morning, he talked about how, afterwards people would assume that he was like a cafe worker and ask him for a coffee, or they'd point out to him, oh, this landscaping needs some work. Can you take care of that? And he's like, I'm a pastor here. But I think it was voices like his that often weren't being heard. And that's how Theology of the Cross works. It's often not that big Sunday morning speaker that everybody's applauding and the guy who's selling, millions of books, partially purchased by his congregation, Mark Driscoll. But it's often that person who's in a smaller spot, who's not getting the attention, who is daring to talk about the countercultural message of Jesus. And I saw it really powerfully in Appalachia too, where there's there's a lot of economic devastation. There's a lot of devastation wrought by the opioid epidemic. There's a lot of empty churches. And at one of those churches we had communion, and the pastor leading the communion was, very elderly, very decrepit. He had a hard time getting through the communion words. And I'm thinking, gosh, this is the death of the church right here. And then we receive the communion meal, and I'm told this is the body of Christ given for you. And for me, that sacrament, we as Lutherans, communion is a sacrament. As I received that, I was just filled with this incredible power of the theology of the cross, and this reminder that Jesus has chosen to be bodily present in this very place, in this quote unquote dying church, in this community that is economically devastated. And Jesus has chosen to be present right here. And so I think the ways for American Christians to beat back some of these messages that have strayed so far from Jesus have caused us to be filled with hate, not only for others, but for each other, have caused us to excuse abuse within our own circles, abuse of women, abuse of children, have caused us to be afraid of our own history. In order to beat that back, we have to lean into these places that have been ignored and people who've been ignored and lift up those voices. And that's where, often it's been the Black church, it's been immigrant churches who have been the carriers of this gospel message throughout American history. And America has that Christian, tradition too. Right. And it has been used too. So these two strains have both always been active in the US. And I think we're seeing a time of potential transition right now where that strain is looking to reassert itself against sort of this social gospel that's become tied up in prosperity gospel.
Right. I mean, I'm curious, you have some updates. You're going to relaunch the book, right? What kind of things COVID hit since the book came out, right? Like a year after it came out. So how did that shift some of the narrative? What kind of things did you revisit? What are we going to see in this new book, and kind of where has that placed you in your thoughts towards what you originally wrote, and kind of going forward, how you're going to play a role in that?
Yeah, so I'm super grateful that the publisher has seen, the continued interest in the book, especially not only around the 2020 election, but as we approach the 2022 midterms. These discussions are just ongoing, not only for Christians, but for people of other faiths, for people of no faith. They're seeing how central this understanding of religion in the US is impacting our politics. So I ended the book on a hopeful note, and that's where you kind of have to be, I guess, as a pastor. And as a Christian in general, like we believe those words that say that hope will never disappoint us. And at the same time, I have become a lot more cynical. I have become a lot more realistic about the ability of dialogue. And what I've begun to say to pastors and to church and university groups who I speak to is that dialogue is powerful only when it goes both ways. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people in this country right now who are not open to dialogue, who are in a place that feels really defensive, really afraid, really nihilistic. So I continually return again and again to Jesus' words from Matthew 10, where Jesus sends out his disciples, and he says them, you're going everywhere to the lost sheep of Israel. But he says, if you go into a house and they don't receive you, you need to know when to shake the dust from your feet. And so I think for people that are looking to do this kind of work and dialogue and this kind of cross-cultural conversational work, for people who are looking to build unity within the church, within Christianity, I think discernment is really an important tool to know, is this social media argument that I'm having with somebody who's not really looking to hear me, is this going to be a vital way for me to spend my time? Probably not. It's important to look at who you're partnering with and who you're talking with. And these last three, the new book comes out August 16th. That'll have been 3 years since the first book came out. Everything has happened, right? I mean, I have little kids. We've been living through COVID with them. My brother-in-law died of COVID at age 43 after a long hospitalization, no prior health conditions. He caught the Delta wave right when it was coming up through Southwest Missouri. So the new subtitle of the book is A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind. So you can see already sort of in the shift from this understanding the voters who elected Donald Trump into what I really want to talk about is not Trump, or is not even voters, but is instead the wreckage that many of us are sifting through in our families, in our congregations, in our communities, that has been wrought by a Christianity that has become inured to the suffering of our fellow human beings. And so we saw that in COVID, right? And I was pretty shocked by the ways in which a Christianity that had called itself for so long pro-life and has said, human life, like this is sacred to us, and yet chose to cast aside the death and suffering of hundreds of thousands of Americans in order to prioritize economic growth, economic stability, consumerism, ability for us to, pretend that our fellow humans weren't suffering. I remember going to visit my brother-in-law in the hospital in Kansas City, and we're in this COVID ward and we're surrounded by, we're all having to completely mask up. He could only have 2 visitors a day. So because we came, his wife, his parents couldn't see him that day. His kids couldn't see him. And it's an incredibly solemn, terrible place to be. And then you walk out into the bright sunlight, and at a time when COVID was circulating like crazy and people in Missouri and Kansas were dying like crazy, we walked out in the Kansas City Plaza and it's like normal life. Everybody's carrying their shopping bags. Everybody's going into the restaurants. Everybody's going into the shops. And there was never any leadership by leading Christian American voices in a really concerted and powerful way to say, let's have a national moment of mourning. Let's have a national time, as, in the Old Testament, the prophet Ezra, the scribe Ezra, gathers the people for this national mourning. There was very little of that on the part of American Christian leaders, particularly on the right, because they chose to ally themselves with an understanding of COVID that did not prioritize human life. So with that, right, and then I'm in Minneapolis. I live 6 miles away from where George Floyd was killed. And that event is aftermath, my participation in some of the clergy marches, understanding more about the protest movement here in Minnesota, really convinced me that even as I wrote my book, talking about Christian nationalism, talking about the fact that Jesus is not American, I think it's really important for us, particularly as white Christians, to say, also Jesus was not white, and to confront like what that means for our theology, what that means for our understanding of ourselves, and what that means for the way we have handled racism in this country, and a real honest accounting for the role of race and the role of whiteness in a Christianity that has, again, prioritized power and money to the detriment of real human suffering. So George Floyd, COVID, and then January 6th, the insurrection. And my experience watching that from here in Minnesota, but also my experience as a pastor in rural America, who, every Sunday morning I'm driving past a little small town that's still covered with Trump flags. Now it's Let's Go Brandon. And, understanding that these are the same flags that were carried by violent would-be insurrectionists to the U.S. Capitol, often with Bibles, with religious imagery, that almost, brings to mind in an extreme way, the Crusades, that there's this sense that Christians have the right to use violence in order to assert their own power. So the new book looks at each of those 3 areas. It talks about my experiences with my brother-in-law, with my rural congregation, and then the neighborhood I live in, my congressional rep is Ilhan Omar. So I'm living in two very different political worlds and consistently watching the ways that God is at work in both.
Yeah. What I think about is how I feel like it would be so simple for general Christians, regardless of denominational affiliation, to actually have unity on like these base issues. And when I'm hearing your story about COVID, and I think like, okay, there's some nuanced conversation that could be had there. Okay, like, okay, I'm a small business owner and I had to close my store. So I could get really upset and go, well, you don't know what it's like for that. And then you could go, you don't know what it's like to have your brother. Like, and I think the problem that I get really sad about is that that's the conversation. And it's almost like our political leaders, it's one thing to expect them to keep doing that and causing that polarization, but it's a whole nother level of depressing reality when that's the same polarization that our church leaders are enforcing and allowing. Because it is, I would admit, it is more nuanced. Like, regardless of where you stand, COVID's killing people. And you can not like masks. Regardless of where you stand on that and whether I like your opinion, why are these massive church leaders not speaking the very simple language of Jesus? It doesn't make sense unless it's all power driven, which it is. Because,
they've become so, and I experienced this as a pastor, when you go out and you buy these big buildings, when you have all this financial outlay out there, you're beholden to financial interests because of your church's mortgage, because of your own, loans, because of the properties that you've now purchased.
Yeah.
I do think there's an economic piece to it for sure.
Absolutely. And again, like I can't help but think about, it's so easy, and I would love to hear your thoughts even on this, but like, it's so easy to demonize someone who, even though their beliefs might be completely erroneous or crazy, at least in my view, but in reality, they're also just kind of like sheep. And I know no one wants to say that. That sounds mean, like, oh, people are sheep, but they kind of are. And really, they just believe what they believe based off decades of where they've attended or what the leaders, which they truly believe God ordained, has told to them. And so I'm curious your thoughts on, like, it's like, yeah, I underlined this book, the last line of your last chapter. We can accept one another, learn from each other, and build an entirely new country built on justice and freedom for all. And I underlined that because my first thought was, hell no, that's not possible. But I now like see the context and you wrote it and all that's happened since even, and it's just like, but it's also not, I feel like it's not impossible in the sense of the people that we should be able to be engaging with. But I almost don't think it's possible until those leaders are speaking out, until they truly take a stand on certain issues. And we're not talking about COVID. We're talking about what simplify that more, like loving our neighbor, engaging in conversation regardless of their political views. I feel like I remember hearing those as a kid even a little bit. Like, there's some people in the congregation that see this or that way, and they were even maybe a little like not great at how they present it, but they still were trying. There's no trying now. It doesn't feel like there's any trying.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I want to be hopeful. I want to like think of how to engage, but it just seems harder and worse. And actually, so hearing your new subtitle is really interesting. The first thing I wrote down that I wanted to, actually, I was initially planning on launching with was Wreckage that it leaves behind. And I was going to kind of play that devil's advocate, like, really? Come on, that's a little intense, Angela. Do you really think, what is that wreckage? But no, like it is. What are you seeing? I mean, you experienced that with your brother. You experienced George Floyd 6 miles away. Where, when you think back to some of those interviews where you were traveling around the country, what are you also seeing? What did you see that maybe you didn't see at the time, but now that you're viewing it through the lens of that Wreckage and Christian nationalism, how are you connecting those now and what you see moving forward in some of those bigger churches, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I mean, as a Christian, we have to believe that death precedes resurrection, right? And so I think we're seeing a lot of death. We're seeing a lot of downfalls. We're seeing a lot of ugliness that's being turned over and lifted up. The first time that I heard about Mark Driscoll, I thought, oh, he's kind of cool. Like he's bringing the men back to church.
Yeah.
And then, not so much. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of death. There's going to be a lot of people whose lives are upended, whether it's from, really financial realities of the Christian marketplace that has supported a lot of people for a long time, mega church jobs, staff jobs. There's going to be a lot of death, a lot of wreckage. And at the same time, that's where God is most powerfully at work. God throughout the Bible is a God of transformation. God throughout the Bible is not a God that goes in and just unilaterally stops human sin before it gets really bad, or stops unilaterally things from happening. But instead, God lets things play out, watches along with it, and works transformation from within. And there's been a lot of times. So I've been at my current congregation a little over 2 years. And there have been a lot of times where I thought, it would be a lot easier to be in a church in Minneapolis. Because when I go, I drive an hour west to my congregation. I serve there 3/4 time. I'm the only pastor. And it truly is two very distinct Americas. You can call it Trump's America versus Biden's America. You can call it red states or blue states. This is an hour apart. And I think what's been really, really important for me personally, and on a larger scale, important for our country, is that we keep having those interactions. Because by me going out there, I'm constantly reminded by, rural America is not two-dimensional. White rural Christians are not two-dimensional, no matter what the demographers tell us. There is diversity of opinion. But again, to your point, we have to be in contact with each other, so I can be there to say to my congregation members, like, I live in Minneapolis. It's not burning down. Like, we have a great park by our house. My kids go to school,
right. The wrath of God isn't.
It's not a total, and at the same time, I can, say to my neighbors in Minneapolis, like, I have a church full of really smart people from rural America who are really working hard and who are trying to, bring their perspective to these issues as well. And their voices are important too, regardless of what their background is. And even just by me, being present in that small community, people have a more nuanced opinion of who a resident of Minneapolis is, who, someone who might vote Democrat is, because it's also, wow, this is the person who came to see my mother in the hospital. This is the person who, buried my wife. And I've seen that really powerfully in my family as well. My brother-in-law, it's my husband's oldest brother who died of COVID. He and most of, my side of the family, as you read in the book, they hold very strong right-wing views, and that encompassed COVID as well, how they understood COVID. And so to walk through that with them and to see them, hearing their political leaders saying, this is the flu, this is no big deal, go out, have fun. And then having to see my brother-in-law heed that advice, not get vaccinated, listen to those leaders, and then be struck with COVID and, leave behind 2 young girls, a stepson who's in high school, a wife whose family, he had worked hard not just to support his family, but to support his extended family. I mean, that's some pretty powerful wreckage. And at the same time, when I've had these hard conversations with my in-laws about, George Floyd or about what's happening in Minneapolis and, the fact that I've taken their poor son out of Missouri, I also was the one who they trusted to do the funeral service for my brother-in-law. And there is this like deep connection that defies political logic. And so if we can just, especially as white Americans, because I think sometimes asking marginalized people to do this type of work is not fair, right? I think it needs to begin with those of us who are in positions of privilege, begin talking to our own family members, our own communities. I struggle with this stuff every day, but I also continue to believe that it is the work that God is calling me and many of us to do.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend recently who she's Black and in the coffee industry, and she said something along the lines of you're choosing to do this right now. I don't choose this. Like, I would rather be talking about just coffee.
Right.
And I think that was a nice conviction for me, because it's like we, those of privilege, which I guess the first step is acknowledging that we have privilege, and being willing to do it intentionally. And by doing it, it doesn't mean you have to go out and, do all this stuff and spend all this time. But I think, to me, just the engagement, being open to those around you. And I try my best to exhort that to both sides. It's like, I don't care if you're full left side. Also, you have to engage. And I guess that's what intrigues me the most about Christianity in this context, is that should be the centerpiece that draws people together. And I don't understand why it's not more, but I'm understanding it more as I have this conversation. So thank you for giving us more insight. And despite the crazy changes the last few years, maybe there's still this glimmer of hope and opportunity to just engage with people. But to your point, let's not waste our breath. Let's not waste our time. Let's find those who are ready to engage, no matter their viewpoints. Sit down and engage. So, Any final thoughts from your end? I really appreciate the time, Angela. Like, I'm excited to see the updates. If you didn't catch it from the beginning, Red State Christians, definitely check the book out. We will have all the show notes and the resources linked over and stuff like that, so people can engage and find those after the fact. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time, and blessings to you as you continue this journey, and cold weather until the summer.
Thank you so much for having me, and coffee definitely made this interview possible this morning. So I love the work you're doing with coffee, and
trying to keep people caffeinated.
Exactly.
Hopefully they can at least, the thing about the conversations we're saying, you don't actually need caffeine, because, everyone gets all hyped up and angry. So your adrenaline really can probably be sustainable in and of itself with these kind of conversations, but it's still,
thank you for the work you're doing.
Awesome, Angela. Have a great afternoon. And brothers and sisters, thanks for joining in, and check out her book, check out the show notes, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Get mad. Get Mad Priest Coffee.